music died the moment she entered. A violin scraped to silence, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against marble. And at the far end of the glittering ballroom, the Duke of Ravenshire stopped breathing. Because the woman walking through the doors of his Christmas ball had died 5 years ago. Snow clung to Clara Ara Whitcomb's cloak as she stepped inside Ravenshire Hall, her gloved hand wrapped firmly around the small fingers of the boy beside her. Oliver looked up with bright, curious eyes. "Is it beautiful in here, Mama Clara Ara?" he whispered. The child's voice was soft enough to vanish beneath the chandeliers, yet the entire room had already gone silent. Clara Ara forced herself to breathe. "Yes," she said gently, "very beautiful." But beauty was not what greeted her. It was shock. The ballroom stretched before her in a sea of candlelight and silk, ladies in satin gowns, gentlemen in polished evening coats, the towering Christmas tree glowing beside the orchestra. And every single person in the room was staring. Whispers began immediately. "Good God! Is that—" But she died. Clara Ara lifted her chin and kept walking. She had imagined this moment 100 times during the long journey back to Ravenshire. She had imagined scandal, cold politeness, perhaps even cruelty, but nothing had prepared her for the absolute, stunned silence that now followed her every step. Beside her, Oliver tightened his grip. He was only 4, but even he could sense the tension hanging in the air. "It's all right," she murmured quietly. Whether she meant it for him or for herself, she could not tell. Then she saw him, Christian Ravenshire, 30 years old, Duke of Ravenshire, standing perfectly still in the center of the ballroom. He had always been tall, but now he seemed carved from stone itself. Broad shoulders beneath a black evening coat, posture immaculate. His green eyes fixed on her with a look that made the distance between them feel suddenly unbearable. 5 years. 5 years since she had last seen him beneath the glow of candlelight. 5 years since the train between London and Bristol had left the rails in a screaming catastrophe of iron and smoke. 5 years since society had buried her name among the dead. And now the dead had walked back into his house. Christian did not move. Not when she stepped further into the room. Not when the whispers spread like wildfire. Not even when Oliver tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mama, why are they looking at us?" Clara Ara knelt quickly beside him, smoothing his small coat with steady hands. "Because they are surprised," she said softly. He nodded solemnly, accepting the explanation with the quiet trust children gave so easily. Then she stood again, and finally, Christian moved. He placed his untouched glass onto a servant's tray without looking away from her. Then he began walking toward her, slowly, deliberately. The crowd parted as he approached, nobles stepping aside as though a storm were moving through the room. Clara Ara felt her pulse hammer in her throat. He looked different, harder. The carefree second son she had once known had vanished. In his place stood a man shaped by duty and grief, a duke. He stopped only a few feet away. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Christian's gaze traced her face with unbearable intensity. The red hair pinned into a widow's style, the pale skin touched by exhaustion, the quiet dignity she forced herself to maintain. Then his eyes dropped to the boy beside her. "Who," he asked at last, his voice low and dangerously calm, "is that child?" Clara Ara felt Oliver press against her skirt. She placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "My stepson," she answered. The words seemed to echo between them. Christian blinked once. "Only once. Your stepson?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "So you married?" It was not a question. Clara Ara forced herself to hold his gaze. "Yes." A pause. "With whom?" "Hugh Merrick," she said quietly. "A gentleman from Gloucestershire." Christian's expression hardened. "And where is Mr. Merrick now?" Clara Ara swallowed. "He died 3 months ago." Something flickered behind Christian's eyes. Relief. Pain. Perhaps even anger. But he showed none of it. Instead, he turned toward the watching crowd. "Music," he ordered calmly. The orchestra hesitated. Then the violins resumed. Conversation exploded through the room in frantic whispers. Christian looked back at Clara Ara. "Come with me." It was not an invitation. It was a command. Clara Ara glanced down at Oliver. The boy's brown eyes were wide with uncertainty. But Hugh's dying request echoed in her memory like a vow. "Take him to England. Make the world see him. Protect him." She nodded once. Christian turned without another word. They followed him through the ballroom, past rows of staring nobles, through a side door and down a quiet corridor lit by candlelight. At the end of it, he opened a heavy oak door. "The library." Clara Ara stepped inside. Oliver clung tightly to her hand. Christian closed the door behind them. The soft thud echoed like a verdict. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke. 5 years. His voice was raw now. 5 years, Clara. He stepped closer. We buried you. His eyes burned into hers. I searched for you. Clara felt her breath catch. You searched? For weeks, he said sharply. Hospitals, villages, the railway line, everywhere. Silence filled the room. Then his gaze dropped again. To Oliver. You disappeared, Christian said quietly. And when you returned? His voice hardened. You returned with another man's child. The library felt smaller after his words. Oliver pressed closer to Clara's skirts, peeking cautiously at the tall man before them. Christian Ravenshire noticed the movement. The boy's brown eyes met his for a fleeting second before retreating again. Something inside Christian tightened unexpectedly. The child was small. Too small to carry the weight of whatever storm had followed his mother back into this house. Yet the boy clung to her with the instinctive certainty of someone who knew exactly where safety lived. Christian forced his attention back to Clara. She stood straight despite the exhaustion etched into her face. 5 years had changed her. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and the quiet confidence she now carried had not existed in the bright young woman he remembered. But the red hair, the clear blue eyes, those had not changed at all. You vanished, Christian said again, quieter now, without a single trace. Clara folded her hands together. I know. That is all you have to say? Her composure wavered for the first time. I survived the wreck, she said softly. The words were simple, but they seemed to alter the air in the room. Christian looked away briefly toward the fire burning low in the hearth. He remembered the wreck too well. The twisted iron, the blackened rail cars, the lists of the dead. He had ridden out 2 days after the accident. He had walked the tracks himself, boots sinking into ash and frozen mud while officials tried to persuade him there was nothing left to find. And when her name appeared among the presumed dead, something in him had broken. I searched every hospital in Bristol, he said quietly. Clara's breath caught. I spoke with survivors, doctors, engineers. His voice grew sharper. I even offered a reward. Her eyes filled slowly with tears. I didn't know. Of course you didn't, he said bitterly. She hesitated. I had no memory. Christian froze. The word struck him harder than any accusation. What? For months, she said, her voice trembling. I did not know my own name. He stared at her. The calm mask of the Duke faltered for the first time. You expect me to believe that? It is the truth. Clara glanced down at Oliver, smoothing the boy's hair instinctively before continuing. A gentleman found me walking along a road near his estate in Gloucestershire, she said. I had been wandering for days after the wreck. Christian's jaw tightened. Hugh Merrick. Yes. The name hung heavily between them. Christian moved away from her, crossing toward the tall bookshelves as if distance might help him think. And when your memory returned? He asked. Clara looked toward the fire. I learned the world believed me dead. And that was reason enough not to return? She shook her head slowly. It was not so simple. Christian turned sharply. Then explain it to me. Oliver shifted uneasily, glancing between them. Clara lowered her voice slightly. When my memory came back, I read the newspapers, she said. I saw that your brother had died. Christian's expression hardened again, and that I had become Duke. Yes. The word came out almost as a whisper. She lifted her eyes to meet his. You were no longer the man I had known. Christian's laugh was short and humorless. I assure you I was. No, she said gently, you were not. He opened his mouth to answer, but she continued before he could interrupt. You had responsibilities, a title, expectations. And you believed I would reject you because of them? Her silence was answer enough. Christian stared at her for a long moment. Then his gaze drifted again to Oliver. How old is he? 4. And his father? Hugh Merrick's son, she replied quietly. From his first marriage. Christian's eyes narrowed. So you became a mother? Yes. He watched the way the boy leaned into her, utterly secure. A strange, unwelcome ache stirred in his chest. Does he remember his father? Christian asked. Only a little. Oliver suddenly spoke. My papa went to heaven. Both adults looked at him. The boy said it simply, with the solemn certainty of a child repeating something he had been told many times. Clara's fingers tightened slightly on his shoulder. Christian exhaled slowly. The situation was becoming clearer and somehow more complicated. You intend to remain here, he said. Clara stiffened, only temporarily. For what purpose? Her hesitation lasted only a moment. Hugh's cousins want Oliver, she said quietly. Christian's eyes sharpened immediately. Custody? Yes. They believe I influenced Hugh to marry me, she added bitterly. They want his estate. Christian felt a slow, rising anger spread through him. Men who circled a grieving child like vultures were not uncommon in matters of inheritance, but something about the idea of these men threatening Clara Ara, threatening the boy who clung to her hand, made his blood run cold. And you came here, he said slowly, because you believe I can stop them. Clara Ara lifted her chin. I came here because Ravenshire is the only place in England where Oliver will be safe. Their eyes locked. For a moment the years between them vanished. Christian remembered the young woman who had once stood beside him in ballrooms and gardens, laughing freely beneath summer skies. That woman had disappeared into smoke and twisted steel, but the woman standing before him now, she was stronger, and she had returned with a child depending entirely on her. Christian walked to the door. You will remain here, he said. Clara Ara frowned. I cannot impose— You can, he interrupted firmly. He opened the door. Because if you leave Ravenshire Hall tonight, society will devour you. His voice softened slightly, and it will devour that boy as well. Clara Ara said nothing. She knew he was right. Christian stepped aside. Your rooms will be prepared, he said. Then he looked directly at her. And tomorrow morning, Clara Ara. His expression hardened again. You will tell me everything. Clara Ara did not sleep well that night. The blue guest chamber was warm, the bed soft beneath heavy quilts. Yet the quiet grandeur of Ravenshire Hall made rest impossible. Oliver slept peacefully beside her, one small hand curled into the fabric of her sleeve as if afraid she might disappear. Clara Ara lay awake staring at the canopy above the bed. Christian's voice echoed in her mind. You will tell me everything. 5 years of silence could not remain buried much longer. Outside the tall windows, snow fell steadily across the gardens, turning Ravenshire into a pale winter dream. But Clara Ara knew dreams rarely survived the daylight. Morning arrived with the quiet discipline of a great house waking. Servants moved through the corridors. Fires were rekindled, curtains drawn. Clara Ara dressed simply in her black widow's gown and brushed Oliver's hair while he chattered sleepily about the enormous Christmas tree he had glimpsed the night before. Is the Duke very important? He asked. Yes, she replied. More important than Papa? The question struck her heart unexpectedly. No, she said gently, just different. Oliver seemed satisfied with that answer. Soon a maid arrived to escort them to breakfast. The breakfast room at Ravenshire Hall was bright with winter light. Christian was already there. He sat at the head of the long table, a newspaper folded beside his plate, his posture as controlled as ever. But when Clara Ara entered with Oliver, his eyes lifted immediately. Something unreadable flickered there. Relief, perhaps even disbelief. He gestured toward the chairs beside him. Please sit. Clara Ara guided Oliver into his seat before taking her own. Servants quietly filled plates and poured tea. The small domestic scene felt strangely intimate despite the vast room. Christian's attention drifted to Oliver again. The boy was concentrating fiercely on spreading jam across a slice of bread. How old are you, Oliver? Christian asked. 4, Oliver replied proudly. Christian nodded. You traveled far to reach Ravenshire? Yes. Was the journey difficult? Oliver considered the question seriously. A little, he said, but Mama Clara Ara said brave boys don't complain. Christian glanced briefly at Clara Ara. Something softened in his expression. The boy clearly adored her, and she clearly adored him. Whatever their past, that devotion was real. Christian turned back to his coffee. I received a letter this morning. Clara Ara's hand froze, from the Merrick family solicitor. The words drained the color from her face. They move quickly, she murmured. They move greedily, Christian corrected. Oliver looked up in confusion. What is a solicitor? Clara Ara forced a smile. A man who writes many letters. Oliver accepted the explanation and returned to his breakfast. Christian leaned back slightly. They intend to challenge your guardianship. Yes. They claim Hugh was too ill to make legal decisions. Her jaw tightened. He was perfectly lucid. That will be difficult to prove. Clara Ara lowered her gaze. I know. For a moment Christian studied her silently. He remembered the shy young woman who once hesitated to speak in crowded rooms. The Clara Ara sitting before him now was different. Exhausted, yes, but resolute, protective, fierce. Do you have a solicitor of your own? He asked. No. Christian exhaled slowly. Then that problem is already solved. Clara Ara frowned slightly. What do you mean? My solicitor will arrive tomorrow. Her eyes widened. You arranged that already? Yes. Christian, I cannot ask you to involve yourself in this. You didn't. His tone was calm but immovable. I chose to. Clara looked at him carefully. Why? Christian held her gaze. Because the truth had been haunting him since the moment she stepped into the ballroom. Because he had searched for her until hope itself had nearly killed him. Because seeing her again had reopened wounds he had never truly closed. But none of that could be spoken. So he gave the only answer a duke could offer. Because it is the honorable thing to do. Clara studied him another moment. Then she nodded quietly. Thank you. Across the table Oliver finished his bread triumphantly. Christian watched the boy wipe jam from his fingers. A strange thought settled in his mind. The child trusted Clara with absolute certainty. And now, whether he liked it or not, Christian Ravenshire had begun to feel responsible for them both. Later that morning, Christian returned to his study. Hartwell entered carrying a sealed letter. The Merrick solicitor again, Your Grace. Christian broke the seal and read quickly. His jaw hardened. Vultures, he muttered. Hartwell remained calm. Bad news, Your Grace? They have already petitioned the court. They want custody immediately. Hartwell paused thoughtfully. And Mrs. Merrick? Christian turned toward the window. Outside in the snow-covered garden he saw Clara helping Oliver build a crooked snowman. The boy laughed loudly as she pretended to scold him for throwing snow. For a moment she looked almost like the girl he once knew. Christian's voice became very quiet. They will not take that child from her. Hartwell inclined his head. I suspected as much. The following afternoon arrived beneath a pale winter sky. Snow still covered the gardens of Ravenshire Hall, though the sun had begun to soften the white edges along the hedges and marble statues. Inside the study, Christian Ravenshire stood beside the window, waiting. His solicitor had arrived precisely on time. Edmund Thorpe was a narrow, meticulous man whose spectacles always seemed to slide slightly down his nose. He had served the Ravenshire family for nearly 20 years, and had the rare ability to look unimpressed by dukes, judges, and scandal alike, which made him perfect for the situation now unfolding. Clara entered a moment later. She paused just inside the doorway, composed but tense. Christian noticed immediately how tired she looked. 5 years had not been kind to her, yet there was also something new in her bearing. Strength. Not the carefree charm he once remembered, but the quiet endurance of a woman who had learned how to survive. Oliver remained upstairs with the maid. This conversation was not meant for children. Mrs. Merrick, Thorpe said politely, bowing his head. Mr. Thorpe? Please sit. Clara settled into the chair opposite the desk. Christian remained standing beside the fireplace. He did not trust himself to sit. The room felt too small already. Thorpe opened his leather folder and dipped his pen in ink. We must establish the facts, he said calmly. Beginning with the marriage. Clara folded her hands tightly in her lap. May of 1844. And the ceremony? St. Mary's Church, Gloucestershire. The officiating vicar? Reverend John Alcott. Thorpe wrote quickly. And witnesses? Hugh's physician, Dr. Samuel Garrett, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Hadley. Excellent. He paused, then glanced over his spectacles. The Merrick family claims Mr. Merrick was too ill to make sound legal decisions. Clara lifted her chin. That is untrue. Can you prove it? Yes. How? Hugh left letters. Christian's attention sharpened immediately. Letters? Clara nodded. Several of them. He wrote them during his final weeks. Where are they? Thorpe asked. With his London solicitor. Christian spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Then we will retrieve them immediately. Clara hesitated. Her fingers tightened together. There is something else you should understand. Thorpe leaned forward slightly. Go on. She took a slow breath. Hugh did not marry me because he loved me. The words hung heavily in the room. Christian's jaw tightened. Thorpe remained expressionless. Then why did he marry you? Clara looked down at the carpet. Because he was dying. Silence followed. He knew Oliver would be vulnerable once he was gone, she continued quietly. His cousins had already begun circling his estate. Christian's hands clenched behind his back. And he believed you would protect the boy. Yes. And did you? Clara's answer came without hesitation. Yes. Thorpe nodded slightly. That will matter greatly in court. Christian watched her carefully. You accepted the marriage out of duty. Yes. And gratitude. Christian's eyes darkened. But not love. Clara looked at him then. Something complicated flickered across her face. Hugh was a good man, she said softly. Christian turned away toward the window. Outside, Oliver's small figure moved through the snow with the maid, dragging a branch behind him like a sword. The sight struck him unexpectedly. That boy had lost one father already. And if the Merrick cousin succeeded, he would lose the only parent he had left. Christian's voice broke the silence. What do Hugh's letters say? Clara swallowed. They explain the marriage. Clearly? Yes. And they confirm it was his decision. Yes. Christian nodded once. Then we will use them. Thorpe finished writing and closed his folder. I will travel to London at once to retrieve the documents. Christian inclined his head. Take whatever resources you require. Thorpe stood. I always do. He left the study with brisk efficiency. The door closed behind him, leaving Christian and Clara alone. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Christian remained at the window. You said you remembered everything eventually. Yes. And by then you knew where I was. Yes. He turned slowly, and still you did not return. Clara's composure cracked slightly. Christian, you chose to remain with him. Her eyes filled. I chose not to destroy your life. His expression hardened. You believed I would see you as a scandal. I believed you deserved better. Christian laughed quietly. The sound held no humor. You believed wrong. Clara looked away. I know that now. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Christian stepped closer, not angry now, only tired. There is something you still are not telling me. Clara froze. What do you mean? When you spoke earlier, he said quietly. You stopped yourself. Her pulse quickened. I said everything necessary. No. His voice softened. You almost said something else. Her breath caught. Christian! What was it? She shook her head slowly. I cannot say. Christian studied her face. He saw fear there, and something deeper. Something that looked suspiciously like regret. Finally he stepped back. Very well. His voice returned to calm ducal control. We will focus on the hearing. Clara nodded, relief and disappointment mixing in her chest. Christian walked toward the door. Rest tonight, he said. Tomorrow the real battle begins. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both understood the truth that had begun to surface. The court would decide Oliver's future. But something far more dangerous had already begun to stir between them, a past that refused to remain buried. Sleep did not come easily to Clara that night. Ravenshire Hall was quiet, the kind of deep winter silence that settled over great houses after the fires dimmed and the servants retired. Oliver slept beside her, one arm flung carelessly across the pillow, his breathing slow and steady. But Clara lay awake staring into the darkness. Christian's voice echoed in her mind. There is something you still are not telling me. He had been right. There was something she had almost said, something she had buried for 5 years. She turned her head slightly and looked at Oliver. The small boy had curled closer in his sleep, instinctively seeking warmth. Clara brushed a hand over his hair. You're safe, she whispered softly. But the truth was more fragile than she wished. Safety had never lasted long in her life. Christian, meanwhile, had abandoned the hope of sleep entirely. He stood on the terrace outside Ravenshire Hall, coatless despite the cold. Snow fell steadily across the dark gardens. The frozen lake shimmered under pale moonlight. His thoughts refused to quiet. Seeing Clara again had reopened wounds he had carefully sealed for years. But it had also awakened something else. Hope. And hope, Christian had learned long ago, could be far more dangerous than grief. He exhaled slowly. Then he heard the terrace door open behind him. Soft footsteps approached. Clara. Even before she spoke, he knew. You will freeze out here. Her voice carried across the snow. Christian did not turn immediately. I needed the cold. She stepped beside him, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. For clarity? For distance. She studied his profile in the moonlight. You are angry with me? Yes. The honesty startled her. But not for the reason you think, he added quietly. She waited. Christian turned then. 5 years ago he had looked at her with easy warmth. Now his gaze carried something far heavier. You should have come back. Clara's chest tightened. I know. You say that now. I said it to myself 1,000 times before tonight. The wind stirred the snow between them. Christian watched her carefully. Why didn't you? Clara swallowed. The answer had never been simple. When my memory returned, she said slowly. I read the newspapers. Christian's eyes narrowed slightly. You told me that already. You became the Duke. Yes. And I had been living in another man's house. Christian said nothing. She continued. I did not know what you felt for me. You could have asked. And if the answer had been nothing? The question lingered painfully between them. Clara looked down at the snow. Hugh was ill, she said quietly. He needed help. And you stayed. Yes. Christian's jaw tightened. You married him. Yes. Silence stretched again. Then Clara spoke more softly. He asked me to protect Oliver. Christian glanced toward the dark windows of the house. You took that promise seriously. He had no one else. And what about you? Clara looked at him confused. What do you mean? Christian stepped closer. Who protected you? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in 5 years. I did not need protection, she said carefully. Christian studied her face. You nearly died in a train wreck. Yes. You wandered half the country without memory. Yes. You married a dying man. Her breath caught slightly. Yes. And now you are fighting his family in court. Clara's voice faltered. Yes. Christian's gaze softened slightly. You have been protecting everyone except yourself. The words struck deeper than she expected. For a moment she had no answer. Snowflakes landed in her hair. You once asked me a question, Christian said quietly. When? The last summer before the accident. Clara searched his face. I do not remember. You asked me whether I believed love could survive silence. Her breath caught. Christian's voice dropped. I told you that silence usually meant the feeling was never real. Clara remembered suddenly. The garden, the roses, the careless certainty of youth. You were wrong, she whispered. Christian's eyes darkened. Was I? She hesitated, then looked at him fully. No. The word left her lips before she could stop it. Christian froze. Clara's voice trembled now. I loved you then. The confession hung in the winter air. Christian did not move. And now? He asked quietly. Clara's heart pounded. The truth sat on the edge of her tongue, but fear still held it back. I cannot answer that tonight. Christian exhaled slowly. He had expected that. Still, disappointment flickered across his expression. Fair enough. Clara wrapped the shawl tighter around herself. The hearing will decide Oliver's future, she said. Yes. And after that? She hesitated. Christian waited, but the words never came. Finally she looked away. I should go inside. Christian nodded once. Yes. They walked back toward the house together, not touching, not speaking, but the silence between them felt different now. Less like distance, more like a door slowly beginning to open, and neither of them knew what would stand on the other side when it finally did. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a gray London sky. The courthouse stood stern and cold, its stone columns rising above the crowded street like silent judges long before any verdict would be spoken. Christian Ravenshire stepped down from the carriage first. Snow from the countryside still clung faintly to the wheels, but here in the city the winter had turned to damp fog and restless noise. He turned immediately and offered his hand. Clara accepted it. Her fingers were cold despite her gloves. Oliver stood between them, clutching her skirt with one hand and a small wooden horse with the other. The boy looked up at the enormous building. Is this where the judges live? Clara knelt beside him. Only during the day. Oliver nodded seriously, apparently satisfied. Christian watched them quietly. In that moment something inside him hardened into certainty. Whatever happened today, he would not let anyone take that child away from her. Shall we? He said. Clara stood. They entered the courthouse together. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Thorpe was already waiting. Your Grace, Mrs. Merrick. He bowed briefly. The Merrick cousins have arrived. Christian's expression darkened. Of course they have. Oliver tugged Clara's sleeve. Who are the cousins? She hesitated. Christian answered calmly. Men who believe money is more important than kindness. Oliver frowned. That sounds very foolish. Christian almost smiled. Yes, it does. The courtroom itself was smaller than Clara expected. Dark wooden benches, tall windows letting in pale winter light. At the far end sat the judge, expression unreadable beneath a white wig. The Merrick cousins stood near their solicitor. The elder one, thin, sharp-faced, watched Clara with thinly disguised contempt. You came prepared, he muttered as she passed. Christian stopped beside her. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a duke. Choose your next words carefully. The man said nothing further. The proceedings began quickly. The Merrick solicitor spoke first. He described Clara as an opportunist, a woman of uncertain origin who had taken advantage of a dying man. He questioned the marriage. He questioned her motives. He even questioned her right to raise Oliver at all. Clara sat perfectly still while the accusations fell like rain. Christian watched her hands. They trembled only once, when Oliver squeezed them tightly. Then Thorpe rose. His argument unfolded carefully. The marriage certificate, the witnesses, the testimony of Hugh's physician, and finally, the letters. The judge read them slowly. The room grew quiet. Hugh's own words filled the courtroom. I marry Clara Ara freely and with full understanding. She has cared for my son with more devotion than blood relatives ever have. If anything happens to me, Oliver's future belongs with her. The Merrick solicitor shifted uneasily. The judge looked thoughtful. Then he turned his attention to Clara Ara. Mrs. Merrick, he said, do you wish to say anything before I reach a decision? The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Clara Ara stood. For a moment she could not find her voice. Then she looked down at Oliver. The boy gazed up at her with absolute trust. Her courage returned instantly. I did not marry Hugh Merrick for wealth, she said clearly. I married him because he asked me to protect his son. She paused. And because he once saved my life when I had no memory, no family, and nowhere to go. The judge nodded slowly. And you still intend to raise the child? Yes. Even now? Clara Ara did not hesitate. Yes. The judge leaned back in his chair. His gaze moved from Clara Ara to Oliver, to Christian. Finally he spoke. The court recognizes the legitimacy of the marriage between Hugh Merrick and Clara Merrick. Relief surged through Clara Ara's chest, but she forced herself to remain still. The guardianship of Oliver Merrick, the judge continued, will remain with his stepmother. A sharp whisper rippled through the room. The Merrick cousins looked furious. But the judge was not finished. And should the Merrick family attempt further interference without legal grounds, he added sternly, this court will not view it kindly. The gavel struck once. It is settled. Clara Ara's knees nearly gave way. Oliver looked up at her. Did we win? She knelt and pulled him into her arms. Yes, she whispered, we did. Behind them, Christian exhaled slowly. A tension he had carried for days finally loosened. Outside the courthouse, snow had begun falling again. Soft. Quiet. As they stepped back into the street, Oliver ran ahead a few steps before turning back. We are going home now? Christian answered before Clara could. Yes. Oliver grinned. Good. The boy ran forward again. Clara Ara watched him go. Then she turned toward Christian. Emotion filled her eyes. You saved us. Christian shook his head. No. His voice softened. You did that yourself. She hesitated. There is something I must tell you. Christian's heart slowed. He had been waiting for this. Tell me. Clara Ara drew a deep breath. The fear that had kept her silent for years finally broke. I loved you before the accident, she said quietly. Christian's breath caught, and after my memory returned, she continued, I loved you still. The city noise faded around them. Christian looked at her as if the world had shifted. Then why didn't you come back? Tears shone in her eyes. Because I thought loving you meant letting you go. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Christian stepped closer. So now I must ask you something. Her pulse quickened. What? His voice was low. Honest. Hopeful. Do you still love me now? Clara met his gaze. This time she did not hesitate. Yes. Snow followed them all the way back to Ravenshire Hall. By the time the carriage rolled beneath the great iron gates, the countryside had softened into a quiet winter world once again. Oliver had fallen asleep against Clara Ara's shoulder, exhausted from the long day. Christian watched them both from the opposite seat. For the first time since she had walked into his ballroom like a ghost returned from the grave, the tension inside his chest had begun to ease. The court had ruled. Oliver was safe. And Clara had finally spoken the truth she had carried for 5 long years. I loved you before the accident. And I loved you still. The words echoed in his mind like something fragile and precious. But Christian Ravenshire had lived long enough to know love alone was never simple, not in a world ruled by titles, whispers, and reputation. The carriage stopped. Hartwell opened the door. Welcome home, Your Grace. Christian stepped down first, then turned to help Clara. She carefully lifted Oliver into her arms. The boy stirred sleepily. Are we home? Yes, she whispered. We're home. That evening, Ravenshire Hall glowed with candlelight. The Christmas ball, delayed by scandal and uncertainty, had resumed. Guests filled the great ballroom once again. Music swelled beneath the chandeliers. Laughter returned. Yet the atmosphere carried a new kind of curiosity, because the entire county now knew the story. The woman who had died in a train wreck, the widow who had returned with a child, and the Duke who had stood beside her in court. Clara paused at the top of the staircase. Her hand trembled slightly on the railing. I am not certain I can do this again. Christian stood beside her. You walked into this room once as a ghost, he said quietly. Tonight you walk in as yourself. She gave a nervous laugh. And what exactly is that? Christian looked at her. Not the widow. Not the scandal. Not the girl society once dismissed. You, he said simply. Then he offered his arm. Shall we? Clara Ara hesitated only a moment. Then she took it. Together they descended the staircase. Conversation softened as guests noticed them. Eyes followed. Whispers stirred. But Christian did not slow. He led her directly into the center of the ballroom. The orchestra faltered for a moment before continuing. And then something unexpected happened. Christian turned toward the gathered crowd. My friends, he said calmly. The room fell silent. Clara Ara looked at him in surprise. Christian rarely addressed society directly, but tonight was different. There has been much speculation about Mrs. Merrick's return, he continued. Murmurs stirred again. Christian ignored them. What matters is not gossip. His voice carried across the entire ballroom. What matters is truth. He turned toward Clara Ara and gently took her hand. For 5 years I believed this woman was dead. The room grew still. When she returned, she did so not for comfort, but to protect a child. He glanced briefly toward Oliver, who stood nearby beside Hartwell. The boy looked terribly important in his small coat. Christian faced the guests again. Anyone who doubts her courage, he said evenly, may speak to me. No one moved. No one dared. Christian turned back to Clara. And there is one more matter. Her breath caught. The ballroom seemed to hold itself perfectly still. Christian lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara stared at him in shock. His voice softened. Clara Whitcomb, not Merrick, not widow. Her name. You once vanished from my life before I could ask you something. Her heart pounded. Tonight I will not wait any longer. Christian looked up at her. Hope and determination burning equally in his green eyes. Will you marry me? For a moment Clara could not breathe. 5 years of loss. 5 years of silence. 5 years of believing the life she once imagined had been destroyed forever. And now, the entire ballroom waited. Christian waited. Oliver whispered loudly from across the room. Say yes. Laughter rippled gently through the crowd. Clara wiped a tear from her cheek. Then she smiled. Yes, she said softly. Christian stood and pulled her into his arms. The ballroom erupted into applause. But the world had already narrowed to just the two of them. You realize, she whispered, society will talk for years. Christian brushed a kiss against her hair. Let them. He looked toward Oliver. The boy grinned proudly. Then Christian returned his gaze to Clara. We have already survived worse. The orchestra resumed its music. Christian offered his hand once more. May I have this dance, my future Duchess? Clara placed her hand in his. You may have every dance. They moved together across the floor beneath the chandeliers. Outside, snow drifted softly over Ravenshire Hall. Inside, the woman who had once been declared dead began a new life, not as a ghost, but as the Duchess of Ravenshire, and beside her, a duke who had never truly stopped loving her.